Okay. Hey, Andrew.
Hey,
So
Yathu.
yeah. So we're here to talk about your book today. Well, your collection that you did with Catherine Alexander called Indeterminacy, which I really enjoyed reading. So yeah, I just wanted to talk to you about it. But before that, can you say a bit about who you are and how you think of yourself as being situated within the anthropological space?
All right, great. Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm Andrew Sanchez. So I teach anthropology at the University of Cambridge. I've been working there for about 5 years. Before that, I worked at the University of Kent. Before that, I was at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. I was also at the LSE. In terms of where I sit within the discipline, I'm interested in questions of labor and economy. I'm also kind of interested in issues of power. I think of myself as somebody that's fairly committed to ethnography, but I also think that the job of anthropology, if it's doing its job properly, is to illuminate things that other people are not able to see. So I don't see anthropology as being primarily descriptive. I do see it as being analytic. So I think that's who I am.
Okay, cool. And so how did this book come about? What are the conversations that you were kind of embroiled in that kind of resulted in this kind of book coming about?
Okay, right. So I've been working in the anthropology of labor and economy for a few years. So my PhD was about changing labor regimes in a town in India. So that was about kind of a heavy industrial context. And what I was looking at was how corruption in trade unions related to the casualization of labor, basically. So I was really interested in looking at these working populations that used to have this one very particular stable identity that all of a sudden had kind of collapsed and things were shifting, right? So I went to the Max Planck Institute in Germany to work as a postdoc. And one of the group leaders of that postdoc was Catherine Alexander. So at that time, I was planning to do new field work in a scrapyard in India, which I then did do. And Catherine's really interested in questions of waste. So she's done a lot of work on that. And she's really interested in value. And essentially, we just were sitting around in the Max Planck Institute, kicking about ideas. And we both thought that kind of change was interesting. We thought classifications were interesting and value was interesting. And it came out of that. And then, like most edited volumes, we then had a process of sitting around thinking of people that we'd heard of or knew that were interesting and might be able to write a nice chapter. And we got in touch with them. And luckily, they did all write nice chapters.
Yeah, they did. Absolutely. And so yeah, I guess, yeah, what you talked about kind of stability and how when that kind of changes, what happens to people, this condition of indeterminacy, you kind of explore it, it's explored different ways in this volume. But why did you choose to see this through, you kind of say it in your book, but through indeterminacy rather than kind of uncertainty or other terms? What issues did you want to kind of foreground through using indeterminacy?
Okay, right. Okay. I mean, so I think, indeterminacy on a kind of a superficial read, it sounds like it would be quite similar to things like uncertainty, for example, but actually it's referring to something quite different. So indeterminacy is the condition of being between orders and being unclassifiable. And to me, and to Catherine as well, I think, we find that interesting because that condition can only exist if those classificatory orders themselves first exist, which means that by focusing on things like indeterminacy, you're able to kind of, counterfactually look at the kind of normative orders. So we thought that was interesting. But indeterminacy is something quite different to uncertainty again, because uncertainty is about a condition of not knowing. It's essentially about epistemology, right? Whereas the condition of indeterminacy, which is being kind of between things, it's not necessarily about not knowing. So, for example, there are loads of people around the world working in working environments which are in some way indeterminate, right? So people kind of working in various sorts of casual employment and so on. Now, you can say that that involves a level of economic uncertainty, and it really does. And that's what we mean when we use terms like precarity. But nonetheless, for a lot of people in those environments, there's a much more profound certainty to their working life, which is that those people are certain that they are alienated. They're certain that their kind of current position is not necessarily moving on and going anywhere else. So I think it's something really different to uncertainty. Also, I mean, there's a few other, and the term we use in the book is cognate terms, right? There's a few other cognate terms that sound similar but aren't. So, for example, you know, the idea of liminality. So in anthropological thought, liminality is that kind of temporary state of being, I think what the phrase is from Turner, betwixt and between, right?
Yeah.
But the issue is that liminality is a process or a condition that's necessarily related to movement and transformation, right? So liminality is temporary. And when that moment has passed, there's a transformation by which a person, for example, becomes incorporated into a position. It's not a permanent state. So for us, we kind of thought that, you know, indeterminacy was a term that really captured something significant about how the world was working for some people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you kind of say maybe in the start that this period of like prolonged or permanent liminality is kind of not so paradoxical, maybe, in the yeah, maybe that kind of describes more like indeterminacy. And also liminal states, I guess you say, is kind of like, yeah, it focuses on this kind of like one thing that exists that waste is like fragments from and then forms another totality, but you kind of want to suspend this out of order thing and kind of like focus on that. Would that be kind of a fair, or yeah, rather than kind of immediately going to like these two totalities, but kind of really kind of pay attention to kind of the indeterminate? Would that be kind of accurate?
Yeah, I think for us, indeterminacy is a concept. It sounds like something that's a kind of a bit kind of vague and pretentious and abstract, but we're really seeing it as something that's, you know, ethnographically can be operationalized, because we're looking at that lived experience and kind of looking at the lived experience and like figuring out that lived experience doesn't necessarily conform to a pre-cut template of what people are, what places are, what experiences are, which is why you need ethnography to go and figure these things out. But in the process of doing that, you can work backwards, as I said earlier, and figure out what the templates are. And that in itself is revealing of, you know, how power works, how class works, how gender works, so on and so on and so on.
So kind of, there's kind of some really great ethnographies here, but is there anything that really comes to your mind in this kind of chapters that really kind of helps unpack kind of the importance of indeterminacy to like current political stage at the moment? Because I kind of like, I really liked the distinction between like the traveling community in kind of Norway and kind of the itinerant like Roma community as well. How does kind of indeterminacy kind of play a role there in kind of yeah, more contemporary politics, do you think?
All right. Yeah, so the chapter you're referring to, that's by Thomas Eriksson. and Katrina Moe-Thorleifsen. And it's a great chapter. It's just a really, really nice ethnographic chapter. I think, I mean, that chapter is an interesting one because it really does relate to kind of questions of like race and ethnicity in a way that the majority of the chapters kind of don't.
Yeah.
In terms of how I would see that speaking to the current moment, we do have to bear in mind that that book was only published in 2018, but actually the kind of the pace of popular politics is so fast at the moment that actually there's a whole bunch of things that if I was co-editing that book now, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I think we would have liked chapters on personally. So for example, I think we're in a very interesting moment globally in terms of how people are thinking about issues of kind of racial identity, ethnicity, and also gender identity. And what kind of seems interesting to me is that on the one hand, you've got this real tension, which is that on the one hand, it looks like there's this very hyper individualized politics where people are really emphasizing their ability to kind of be fluid and to change and to remake themselves and be transformative, right? And that does seem something that's kind of, really important to the zeitgeist. And I think actually, in some of the chapters we got in that book, that's something that people find really empowering. But at the same time, that's an important way of being a human these days. I think we've also seen something of a kind of a hardening of the categories themselves, which seems kind of, it's not quite contradictory, but it's a tension that's worth thinking through, right? So, for example, I think there's a real tendency in kind of current politics for people to think about things in terms of absolutes. So, for example, that if you are one thing, kind of in terms of like race or gender or anything else, then the assumption is that maybe you have the ability to transform into a new thing, but the thing itself is fully itself. And if you are that thing, you fully inhabit it, and you necessarily believe and are all the things associated with it.
Right.
Which to me is a kind of like a real sort of like a problematic shortcut in how people are thinking about social life.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Kind of, you're shifting to kind of, shifting to totality, kind of already classified kind of states.
You know what I mean? It's like, I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. I was talking to my wife about it actually, right? And her phrasing of this, I think, was completely correct. She said that at the moment, we're seeing a real resurgence of the body as a locus of identity. Now, that's not to say that the body is not important and that like kind of people's identity is not rooted in their body, but it's the idea that actually this is something that is full and complete, and there are kind of social symbols and things that are attached to it, and that you can somehow understand the totality of a person by just looking at their state somehow. And I think actually, these are things that are coming out in quite an interesting and creative way in sort of debates around kind of, whiteness and blackness and so on, where you've now got a whole bunch of people like really doing some interesting, creative and very difficult analytic work, actually trying to figure out what things like that mean, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, for anthropology, those are debates that, to me, they seem to kind of come back in cycles, and we're in the kind of, the upswing of a cycle of interest in those things at the moment. But there are lots of people that have kind of that haven't engaged with the earlier cycles. And in other disciplines, they're debates that people have been digging into in a really serious, intelligent way for a long time. It's just that, somehow anthropology kind of has managed to kind of silo itself off and hasn't noticed that in education studies, critical whiteness scholars have been trying to figure out, whether or not kind of ethnic identity is, absolute and totalizing. They've been doing it for a really long time and they've been doing a good job.
And I guess that's quite interesting in how that might overlap with kind of politics, in sense of like politics seems to require at the moment kind of these categorization of people to kind of advocate for their kind of rights, or kind of people gaining maybe agency kind of through using kind of certain kind of labels and categories. How does that, what do you think is the importance of indeterminacy when it comes against people that might say those categories that people identify with are kind of really important?
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm not here to kind of argue against categories. I mean, for example, the ability to be part of a community is a really integral part of most of the major political transformations that kind of the modern world has seen, right? So essentially, if we were going to kind of talk about this in slightly old-fashioned terms, that's what we, that's an important kind of basis for political consciousness, essentially, right? So to say, I am part of this broader thing, that at least gives people something to kind of hold on to and gives them a basis for like action and resistance and so on. So I think that's what kind of, Black Lives Matter has really, really shown that, right? Like it's really shown like kind of, collective will and resistance and kind of shown you how power works. And Me Too did the same thing, I think, right? In relationship to gender politics. But at the same time, I mean, I think you can think through the kind of the positive and the positive and inspiring aspects of that politics, while still paying attention to the fact that there are lots of kind of people and lots of experiences who are defined by the fact that they fall between the gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's what I kind of liked about indeterminacy as a concept, that it doesn't have to come at the expense of this kind of like the importance of categories, that actually is kind of important to have like internally those conversations about like those people that might not quite fit in within this kind of broader categories of like brown or black or like, and I was and I remember reading your articles on like, I think it was decolonizing the curriculum. I forgot the exact name of it, sorry. But I think it opens with this kind of, you open with this powerful memory of, I think, walking down a train station and then kind of getting attacked and this person wanting to know your kind of ethnicity, and it was kind of indeterminate to them. It was, and that was kind of, a powerful scene. And then you kind of talked about how you have like different roots as well within like, how as well, and like which part of you can you say in that moment, do you think like there's your personal experiences also maybe you formed you to like identify with this idea of indeterminacy maybe as well?
I do think that. I do think that. I'm in two minds about this because like somehow without planning to do so, I've ended up publishing a whole bunch of stuff where I talk about myself, right? And actually, like, I kind of hate reading anthropology when people talk about themselves, because I think like
really?
research subjects are the most interesting part. Like anthropologists aren't that interesting, right? So I kind of hate reading that stuff. But then somehow when I've been doing the writing, what I'm doing is I'm like kind of sitting there and I'm sort of thinking about it in like, pedagogic terms, right? I'm thinking, what kind of information or story does the person reading it need to have in order to kind of get what I'm trying to say? and in order to get drawn into the narrative. And like, you know, I'm one of these people, it's like when I give lectures to students, I kind of try and give people like a real story from my real life. And I say, here, you can relate to this because you're talking to me. Now, actually see how you would use that to understand this much more kind of distant and abstract thing. So that's kind of what I was doing in that thing you're talking about. But actually, like in the process of doing that, you figure out a lot more about yourself, like things that you didn't know that you knew, right? So when I was writing that article you were talking about, it was making me kind of relate to memories that I hadn't accessed them for a really, really long time, right? So that incident you're talking about, where like a bunch of blokes kind of beat me up and like spat on me in a train station, like, you know, after asking me about my race. I hadn't thought about that for years and years and years. It happened when I was 18, and now I'm like, you know, a middle-aged man, right? I hadn't thought about that for years and years and years.
Yeah.
And then in the process of writing the article, I kind of realized that for the whole time I was growing up, I was one of these people that I never fitted into any of the boxes, right? And actually, it's now with the benefit of hindsight, it's completely clear to me that that's what attracted me to anthropology, right? I was one of these people, I kind of, you know, I was never sure what my ethnicity was because it didn't fit into any of the boxes there were.
Yeah.
Like all of those kind of things, none of them ever kind of added up.
Yeah.
And going to anthropology, it was like a way of like figuring out, all right, these things I'm interested in, how are they constituted all around the world? And then now, you know, you get to like a much later stage in your life, like I'm nearly 40, and I've kind of got to the stage where it's like for personal reasons, I don't want any personal answers. I'm just I'm just happy doing me. I don't want to be in anyone's box or anyone's team. I'm just happy just being me.
Yeah. I really kind of identify with that. I think kind of I guess there's always this kind of experience that these kind of different categories always seemed kind of and I think I'm interested in uncertainty because of these kind of that seemed to capture my sense of these categories and beings. Like sometimes I just felt like, I just feel kind of deeply uncertain about this, even though kind of like I would advocate for kind of the politics and stuff. And I kind of thought maybe highlighting the indeterminacy and kind of uncertainty kind of attends to the kind of emotional states that and the kind of people kind of live through. And I think your story kind of highlighted that kind of like the personal side of kind of everyday living that happens. So just to kind of move on from that, I think in that thing you also say, you know, you used to have dreadlocks and you have like traveling routes as well and like a bunch of other stuff as well. And it was interesting in this collection kind of drawing relation between I guess waste and migrants and kind of people. So what is the thinking there in kind of drawing relation between like matter out, like dirt is matter out of place, and or what is the thinking in this book in relating kind of waste and people?
Right. Well, I think like the different authors in the book all have their own thinking on it. I mean, I can tell you what my thinking is on it at the moment, and I'll leave the authors to kind of tell you themselves, right? I suppose, right? I mean, I think, and here I'm not speaking for my co-editor Catherine. I think that the kind of the waste metaphor has a really sort of problematic place in understandings of populations and alienation and expulsion, right? So that goes right back to Marx, right? It goes back to Marx's idea of surplus populations, the lumpen proletariat, and so on. And it's the idea that if capitalism is, you know, a kind of like a rapacious but modernist order, it has a tendency through time to constantly cast aside and expel people and to no longer need them. And you'll see that replicated in a whole bunch of kind of current work on expulsions, on labor, on migration, so on and so on and so on. Now, to me, that's problematic, because those same populations that are kind of thought through with this loose waste metaphor, they're populations that in a kind of a strict economic sense have value, right? I'm not talking about like have value kind of as human beings, because I just assume everyone has value as human beings.
Yeah.
I mean that there are people deriving surplus value from them, right? They're making a contribution to the economies in which they live, right?
Right.
So, I mean, you're kind of you told me earlier, you're studying in goldsmiths. So you've been living in London and whatnot, right? London's full of people that would be described as these kind of like, you know, surplus excess populations shunted around the world and so on and so on and so on. There are people exploiting them and deriving value from them, right? Now, I think the notion of kind of surplus populations as lacking value, it's based not just on a misunderstanding of the people we're talking about, but also a basic misunderstanding of what waste is, right? The metaphor itself is wrong. So, I mean, it's something that we explored in that book, and this is something that kind of Catherine is particularly interested in, is the idea that, you know, waste is not the antithesis of value. Right? Waste is not the absence of value. Waste is a kind of, it's a temporary condition of being temporarily in the wrong space for that value to be realized. And it's when a thing or an object or a person shifts into a different social stage that the value can be extracted, right? So the sort of like, you know, the most kind of, you know, simplistic material way of thinking about it is like, you know, looking at your recycling. Right. You open a tin of beans in your kitchen, eat the beans, the tin is just rubbish, chuck it in the recycling bin, it's worth nothing, right? Yeah. But when someone comes and collects it from your house and takes it somewhere else and does something to it, it shifts into a different regime of value and becomes worth something, right? So the value was always there the whole time. It's just that it has to be in the right context for it to be extracted, which is why kind of, you know, value is necessarily social. Right? So I think it's, you know, an assumption that waste has no value is something that kind of gives rise to this idea of like, you know, these useless surplus populations of people that are kind of, you know, feckless or idle or not wanted or not productive, right? But human beings, right, with, you know, very limited exceptions, human beings are socially productive because we are social animals, right? They're economically productive because the economy is necessarily a kind of, you know, like a web of human interactions. Just in the same way that that kind of bean tin, it looks like rubbish when it's in your hands, the value's in there, right? It just has to be in someone else's hands for it to be realized.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And it's kind of, yeah. And it's kind of, it was kind of interesting kind of in the Norwegian context, well, in other contexts as well, that kind of, that their discourse on kind of thinking through travelers and Roma community were also centered around like, kind of discourse on waste as well, which I thought was interesting, but and kind of spoiling nature as well. And it just, and I guess like, like waste is something that has to be socially constructed in kind of, would you agree? Or
I mean, what waste is classificatory, right? So I mean, if we were having a different conversation, like you know, having a different conversation, you know, as scientists or as ecologists, then we might say that there's like an objective condition by which waste is a byproduct from some other process, right? But for the purposes of the discussion we're having, processes that it's a byproduct from are
Mhm.
social processes, which means it
Yeah.
must be socially constructed.
Yeah. And what, in terms of like analytics, what do you think is the role of the anthropologist in determining what is indeterminate? You know, it's kind of, you know, you could argue like a lot of things are indeterminate. So and I think what do you see as the role of the anthropologist in kind of bringing this almost kind of, yeah, like ethic category into this kind of analysis?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. And I think, I mean, essentially, you could ask almost exactly the same question about any kind of operative analytic term,
Yeah.
just by crossing out indeterminacy,
Yeah.
replacing something else, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. I mean, perhaps this is at odds with like some of the things
Mm-hmm.
that you might have derived from reading that edited volume.
Mm-hmm.
But as a social scientist,
Mm-hmm.
my kind of inclinations as to what we're doing, they're probably like slightly positivistic, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think our job is to go out into the world
Mm-hmm.
and to look at data.
Mm-hmm.
It just means that, you know, as an anthropologist, your data is
Mm-hmm.
particularly complex because it is subjective, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the data includes not just things people do and like stuff they make, it also includes the stuff that's going on in their head, like their ideas, right? So our job is to look at all of those things and then to come up with, you know, insightful and original analyses of them,
Mm-hmm.
which in some way would help other people to better understand what's happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the course of doing that, I mean, if you've kind of picked up a sort of a big idea like indeterminacy, and you've just used it as a sledgehammer to smash things to pieces
Mm-hmm.
and decide that, you know, everything in the world must be indeterminate, then you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Right? You have to be using it in a way that would be constructive and would help people to understand things.
Yeah.
And in doing that, you have to be taking account of the bits of the data that are the things in people's heads, right? Which is a way of saying, you know, it's exactly what you'd expect an anthropologist to say, is that you have to take account of the emic perspectives on it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. You know, you could ask that question of like, you know, for example, I think I was just writing something about gambling. So it's like, you know, everything is gambling, right? So it's kind of, you know, you have to kind of make it kind of specific. But yeah, in this case, it was kind of like, you know, a term that you're introducing, but I guess you have to make it really relevant to kind of, and yeah, and throughout the chapter, I wasn't kind of, yeah, it's convincing that like, you know, these are conditions of indeterminacy, the like the Kazakh miners, the Estonian miners that are kind of living through these conditions of indeterminacy. Do you, I mean, maybe this is more a personal question, but like, do you think we're living through like under greater conditions of indeterminacy as to like kind of before, or greater conditions of uncertainty?
Okay. Right. I mean, like, so, I mean, I think that in reference to the things that interest me,
Mm-hmm.
which are like, you know, work, power, and economy, and so on,
Mm-hmm.
I think a larger proportion of the world's population
Mm-hmm.
is has the experience of being in somehow an indeterminate condition
Mm-hmm.
than they have at any point in my lifetime. But then again, I'm not that old, right? Probably more people have that experience now than at any point since the early 20th century. And what that's a consequence of are those kind of like cyclical kind of huge changes in the ways in which economies work, the ways in which democracy functions, and so on and so on and so on, right? So some of the examples that you just mentioned about Kazakhstan and Estonia, those are examples where kind of quite clearly a very sort of a very cohesive modernist order that was socialist has kind of collapsed in the course of a single, in the space of our personal lifetimes. and is now kind of being replaced by something else, which is why you've got all of these people whose experience is that they kind of don't quite fit into the new categories. And that's because they belong to an older category that doesn't exist anymore, right?
Yeah.
So my guess, and I'm not a historian, so I would just wait for kind of, somebody watching this video who is an historian to kind of, correct me or do the work on it. My guess is that the things I'm talking about here, they are necessarily cyclical, right? I would think that you can kind of look to those grand moments in human history where you see these really big changes in how people do things. And my guess is that there would always have been a whole bunch of people falling between the cracks, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I probably agree with you that it is kind of, I think you say in the start, kind of relating this to the kind of post-Enlightenment period as well, this attempt to create order, like increasing the drive to create order and kind of certainty maybe does produce kind of conditions where the carpet is removed from people underneath people's feet, like everything was forever until it was no more, right? And I think it's interesting in the book, I think it's powerful where I think you say kind of like whether if it's like communism or kind of like market ideology, everyone's kind of imagining this like very total, like this like permanent total state. And when that collapses, it kind of creates this kind of indeterminate state. And well, I thought you were connecting that to kind of this kind of still this Enlightenment logic of just kind of reason, order, kind of planning out the future in kind of the long run, and maybe sticking with the indeterminacy and sticking with the uncertainty might reveal kind of new ways to be and new kind of modes of governance.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. I mean, I'm not kind of, I'm not in the business of making predictions.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think,
not in a book about indeterminacy.
No. I mean, personally, I'm looking around at, how people are thinking about labor organizing, for example. And I think if I was in the business of making predictions, it's quite likely that in the course of my own lifetime, we're going to see really profound changes in how people are thinking about kind of collective action, the identity of a kind of a worker and so on. Now, obviously, there's always profound changes going on, right? They've certainly, since kind of, since the kind of birth of neoliberalism, a great many changes have happened in that area. But I really think, the kind of progressive casualization of labor is something that kind of really changes the notion of a coherent work identity. I also think that, and again, these are things that my guess is that probably anyone would say this, so it's probably not that insightful, but my guess is that, since kind of the COVID-19 pandemic, where you've seen this massive explosion of remote working, again, that's going to really, really change the way in which people are mobilizing on a work-related basis, because the notion of a workplace, I mean, as an actual space, it doesn't mean quite as much for so many people as it did even 2 years ago, right? And also the kind of, necessarily the issues that people would be collectively strategizing on, they have to be different too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Go on, sorry.
No, you go.
I mean, I was going to say, like, for example, I mean, you're speaking to me, I'm sitting in my kitchen right now, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, what the kind of viewers of the video can't see is that, the setup I've got is that I've got this laptop on my kitchen table, which is really precariously balanced on a great big pile of books. And I've got like one of those halo lamps that's precariously balanced on a higher pile of books. And it's this kind of like, like a rubbish home office setup. That's kind of, I mean, actually, that's like, that's one of my kind of gripes with the working world now, right? But it's a different kind of gripe that I could have had until fairly recently, because it's kind of somehow it's my employer's responsibility because I'm at work when I'm doing things like this. But also actually there's no kind of clear mechanism for kind of, you know, articulating those grievances, on saying what health and safety in the workplace should look like. Like, what does it mean that I'm spending all day sitting on a chair that's not a proper office chair because there's no room in the house for an office chair? People all around the world are having those experiences, right? And we're going to find out, like, in our own lives, we're going to find out how that kind of new indeterminate work status gives rise to completely new ways of doing politics.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we're running out of time, but yeah, quickly, I think that was kind of highlighted in kind of the Kazakh returnee, kind of the oral man that kind of, was it, I'm not sure if it was Catherine Alexander or who talked about the oral men, but it was, and also the distinction between that and the Mankurds, who could make best use of kind of, were more entrepreneurial and could make use of like the state of like indeterminacy as well. And it's kind of interesting, the people that can make best use of indeterminate states and kind of people that kind of but also how indeterminacy can kind of oppress as well, and this double-edgedness of like possibilities and lack of possibilities. It's kind of interesting in that kind of state. Anyway, so realize you gotta go off soon. So yeah, for people reading this book, what is like one key thing that you think you'll be happy if they took away from this book?
Happy if they took away from it. I would be happy if it made people think carefully about the kind of social and economic values of people and processes that don't fit into the existing templates, right? And I suspect that's not a really satisfying answer to your question.
No, that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's what I'd hope they take away from it. Yeah, I should say, I think, you know, the concept of indeterminacy, like as an analytic framework, that's not, we didn't come up with that for the book, right? So that's not, you know, I haven't like helped sort of develop that framework. That's been kicking around in, you know, philosophy and other disciplines for a long time, and people have done good work with it. Like, to me, the edited volume, the value it brings to the world is that it shows people the possibilities of good ethnographic research, right? So if the book is worth anything, it's worth something not because of the framing of the book. It's, you know, it's the people that wrote those ethnographic chapters, right? We had a really nice bunch of authors. We kind of gave them an idea to think with that was fairly challenging and possibly quite frustrating. And they went away and they used it as creatively and also incisively as they could. And they came up with a really nice bunch of chapters, right? Chapters that can tell you something about, you know, ethnicity and labor and, you know, gender and art in one instance. So I think, yeah, that's what I like about the book.
Nice. Okay, cool. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for your time.
All right, great.
Let me